Hi, good morning, everyone. It is my great honor to do a presentation for the very first time at the annual Mongolian Studies Conference. Is the microphone on? Is the mic on?
That's not the one. Sorry. This one is my mic, but I think it's somewhere here. I don't know what is. Was it? How's that? Oh, there you go. Okay.
It's working now. Well, again, hi, good morning, everyone. It's my great honor to do a presentation for the very first time at the annual Mongolian Studies Conference. I do not represent the Minister of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat. Rather, I attend this conference as an individual researcher. My presentation is briefly about the national literacy campaigns that the people of Mongolia as a nation experienced back in the period between 1936 and 1945. The most striking and challenging timeline in the nation's literacy history. The pre-World War II and the World War II Mongolia experienced two successive but contradictory nationwide literacy campaigns. The one based on the traditional Mongolian script, the other on the Russian alphabet. There were two separate Latinization experiments conducted prior to 1941, one in the early 1930s, the other in between these two campaigns. The research is still going on, and what I'm planning to do now is present my initial findings and views related to these two campaigns. I examined the two campaigns and attempted to weigh the two against each other by focusing on the success stories, failures, challenges, and lessons. By many historic accounts, the first nationwide and the mass literacy campaign to reach out to every strata of the population and each and every IMAG in Mongolia was probably launched in 1936. The following years, the campaign intensified. Let's take a look at what was achieved year by year. Under the 1936 government literacy plan, some 15,000 illiterate people were planned to become illiterate that year. The year-end report indicates some 7,300 people learned to read and write. The IMECs are at the bottom. They topped the literacy marathon for that year. The 1937 was the most successful year of the campaign, with 15,000 illiterates turned to potential readers. The number of people attending literacy classes for 1938 hit 31,000 people. However, the 1938 target was half reached, with 10,600 people officially receiving a certificate of literacy, but still another successful year compared to 1936. IMEC listed here came out as the leaders with relatively high success rates of achieving the annual literacy objective. The number of people who were learning to read and write peaked in 1939. As the year-end report claims, around 33,000 people were learning nationwide in the traditional Mongolian. The end result was almost 14,000 new additions to the community of literates. Unfortunately, an abrupt downturn was recorded for the 1940 campaign. Out of 50,000 target number, merely 2,000 people were able to become literate. I will explain a bit later why this was so. This is the summary of the first 5 successive year literacy campaign. All the data shown here are not my calculations. Rather, they are official government reports of the time, including the percentage figures. The exception is the 5-year average that I have done for analysis purpose. The 8th State Equoral, or National Assembly, convened in late June 1940, issued one historic resolution, among others. The most well-known definitely was the adoption of the new constitution. Another one was for Mongolia to shift to Latin, starting from 1941, and turn Latin alphabet-based nation by 1945. That's within 5-year time. Remember, this was the second time in the pre-World War II Mongolia that Latin was announced to be adopted as the nation's official writing system. While encouraged by the government, nationwide discourses began to develop from July 1940 through January 1941 about the new Latin Mongolian script grammar. A large poster showing the Latin alphabet, like this one on the Sukhbata Square, was distributed over to all IMSC. Newspapers began to publish routinely, as back in 1931 and 1932, a series of ABC lessons on the Latin usage. Then a question may come, why a shift to Latin? What prompted this move? Well, in my view, there were 2 key reasons for the Latinization attempt. The one was the common belief in the world revolution, rooted in the Soviet Russia that deeply occupied people's mind in Mongolia at the time, according to which Latin would serve as the only and unifying international alphabet in the future world. There's a whole lot of history on this topic. I will not elaborate on this. The other reason perhaps was the gravity of the early 20th century Western technological achievements that were relatively well known and widely applied in Mongolia from the dawn of the century through World War II years. Here we can talk about Ford and Dodge motor cars that were widely used in Mongolia in 1920s and 30s, Western companies that were operating in Mongolia, Mongolian students studying in Germany and France, nation's initial industries that were equipped with Western machineries and tools, about everyday commute by UB cyclists on Opel make bicycle, the Victrola gramophone that is pictured here, that helped change the way of socialization among the general public, etc. All this cumulatively made the nation's leaders and the public to view that the future prosperity of the nation undoubtedly lies in mastering Latin. And this was openly documented and reflected in many 1940 government reports. On February 21st, 1941, the joint session of the Presidium of the State Small Khural and the Council of the Ministers finally issued a resolution on the adoption of Latin as the nation's new alphabet. Then Latin was then praised by the nation's leaders as a catalyst for Mongolia to reach prosperity in many areas, like industry, education, commerce, culture, defense, etc. Again, Latin was promoted at the time as the only future universal writing system. And interestingly, Latin was claimed to be perfectly fitting the Mongolian spoken language. Fortunately, the official shift to Latin lasted merely a month, as the government hurriedly issued a fresh resolution on March the 25th about the adoption of the Russian alphabet for the nation. Only these 3 slim excuses were announced by the government for the shift to the Russian alphabet. This is what happened to Mongolia in March 1941. This is the reality. The first picture shows the short-lived Latin alphabet. The second one, the new Russian alphabet. The birth alphabet published on the Arding or the People's Right newspaper, just 26 days apart. Well, I can imagine that the government move sent shockwaves all across Mongolia, making the entire nation stunned and forcing the people to undergo a painful and challenging experience of learning an alien language script. Well, in contrast to the 1930s Mongolian traditional script learning campaign achievements, the initial experimental years of applying the Russian script in the first half of the 1940s saw failure after failure. The government annual action plan from 1941 through 45 on educating people in the new Russian alphabet never met even its nearest objective. This was largely attributed to the considerable passivity and inactivity displayed by not only the then Ministry of Enlightenment itself, but government and party authorities at all levels, non-governmental organizations, industrial workers, and private people across the country, as the sign of utter discontent over the adoption of the Russian alphabet. This chart shows the 5 straight-year result of the Russian script learning campaign. The 5-year result is 15.68%, which is much lower than the previous campaign average. And based on evidences and findings gathered as a result of my research, I speculate that the people of Mongolia then launched a silent protest against the new Russian script to replace the centuries-old, well-established, well-sold, unique and classical writing system. This is the comparison between the 2 campaigns with the all annual and 5 consecutive year average data reflected. As you can see, the Mongolian script learning campaign has been a quite success, whereas the Russian script learning campaign yielded no desired outcome. And several figures here suggest interesting stories themselves. For example, again, the most successful year out of the 10-year-long 2 consecutive campaigns was 1937, the year of terror. The decline in the campaign outcome the following 1938 and 39 is obvious. Literally a big portion of the nation's intelligentsia, who definitely sought to teach illiterates, was then purged and eradicated due to the Bolshevik orchestrated genocide. Another poor performance for 1940 can be explained by the fact that many people then tended to be reluctant to learn the traditional Mongolian script in the light of shortly expected nationwide transition to Latin next year. Coming back to 1942 and 43 results showings, I suspect these are misrepresented and inflated figures, as such false reports have been commonplace under the previous command regime to evade punishment of all sorts for mismanagement and failure in achieving any national and local planned actions. There are other reports indicating much lower figures for these particular years. Proceeding from this, I boldly suggest that the real 5-year average result of the Russian script campaign should fall under 10%. The public perception in Mongolia and perhaps internationally about Mongolia's transition to the Russian script has long been and still is a rapid and smooth process. Not really. Not really. Despite the public negligence to learn the Russian alphabet, very intriguing testimony I have discovered with regard to the adoption of the Russian script is that the Ministry of Enlightenment for over 10 years has been reluctant to stir up public affection for the new writing system. In general, newspapers and books continued to be printed in the traditional Mongolian well through 1945 and beyond, whereas basically all international correspondence was executed in the traditional Mongolian. This slide shows select few examples of the application of the traditional Mongolian even after 1941 officialship to the Russian alphabet. This is Choibalsan's official invitation letter dated May 14, 1941 to the government of the Soviet Union as well as to the government of the Soviet republics of Buryatia, Kalmykia and Kazakhs to attend the 1941 Northern National festivities. Resolution of the Mongolian People's Party Central Committee dated May 29, 1945 on placing an order for Russian script printing machines that were badly needed then for everyday party activities. A 1945 poster calling the Mongolian public to vote for the nation's independence and plebiscite exerted by the Republic of China. Next picture is Mongolia's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Choibalsan's official letter dated on November 13, 1945, delivered to Chinese Foreign Minister, notifying the results of the plebiscite. Choibalsan's letter of June 3, 1946, to first UN Secretary General Trygve Lie, requesting for Mongolia's admission to UN. Another Choibalsan letter to Trygve Lie, dated October 11, 1948, urging the Secretary General to have Mongolia's request for admission to UN considered by the UN Security Council and the Third UN General Assembly. A certificate of the technical school issued on June 10, 1946 to its graduates. And finally, the 1949 amendment to the Constitution printed in the traditional Mongolian. To sum up again, the Mongolian script literacy campaign has been a considerable success as a majority of the public demonstrated a strong will for becoming literate in the traditional Mongolian script. The nation's overall literacy rate surged from 5% in 1934 up to 20% by 1940. 20% of the entire population, meaning roughly around 40% of the adults. Quite an encouraging number. In contrast, the initial experimental years of transition to the Russian alphabet has ended up, I would call, as a debacle. The whole nation seemed to be acting against the abrupt shift to the Russian alphabet. Finally, achievements, challenges, failures, and lessons delivered by both campaigns are worth studying and applying in our days, in the years to come, when Mongolia is considering to become a dual script nation by 2025 or maybe later. Today, many schoolboys and girls, as well as university students in Mongolia, are willing to learn the traditional Mongolian. This is one of the striking examples. The boy's name is Munkirdin, grade 3 primary school boy who fluently reads and expertly writes the traditional Mongolian and shares his skill with his classmates and many other school children. This is the January 27, 1936 Arting Untsni Irh, or the People's Right newspaper edition, which carries a very interesting story about a 6-year-old boy tutoring a 66-year-old man in the traditional Mongolian in the very height of the yet successful literacy campaign. Munkirdin, seen here, receiving from the Prime Minister one of the top prizes early in January. at the annual National Calligraphy Contest awarding ceremony. The literature used in my research include 1930s and 40s newspapers Arting Unsni Erich, The People's Right, and Uning, The Truth, archival documents, government reports, books and other sources printed in those years, late research works by some local Mongolian and international researchers, as well as UNESCO documents on literacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we maybe have time for one question. Yeah, that's a good thing. All I want.
Very interesting presentation. I have a question. How did the institution intercede his? You have numbers, statistics.
Yes.
Do you know how did they measure those things by percentage?
Well, those numbers are, again, as I expressed earlier, official government reports.
In general, was it like reading tests or reading skills or just recognizing alphabet or what was the?
Very good question. I'm working on this. I said that this research is still ongoing. Thank you.